Hello everyone, my name is Colin Graham. I'm the lecturer on 249 Victorian Literature. I'm recording this first lecture because I wasn't able to attend the lecture on Monday of week one because I was in hospital. I'm having an operation and I also have to go for a checkup next Monday, so I'll be recording the second lecture as well, both the lectures streamed on Moodle. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do in this recorded lecture is set out for you the module structure, some details about the module, and then also introduce the Victorian period to you from the point of view of the module, give you a kind of historical overview, and look at some of the themes and so on that we might address in the text that we read. So let's just start with the lectures. When I can get back to lecturing, the lectures will be on Monday at 2 p.m. in JHL 6, and hopefully you've already signed up for all your tutorials, and those begin in week 2. The module assessment is in two parts. The first part is based on a reading journal, which will be due after study week, and the reading journal will be answering a series of pretty simple questions on Great Expectations, the novel by Charles Dickens, which will take up the first part of the module. You'll answer those week by week, and they will accumulate into a reading journal, which will be your thoughts on Great Expectations. The second piece of assessment then will be at the end of the semester, which will be a 50% essay, which you'll submit once the module is finished. So the module content is outlined on the screen here. You'll see that the first block of the module up to study week, we'll study Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations, which is published in 1860 and 1861. And then after study week, we'll look at two poets, Alfred Tennyson, then Christina Rossetti, and we'll finish off by looking at some of the stories about Sherlock Holmes written by Arthur Conan Doyle, and we have a week there for revising and thinking about the assessment. So for the module, you need to have access to two books. The first is Great Expectations by Dickens. The recommended version and the book that I've ordered for the bookshop is the Penguin Classics version, but any version will be fine as long as it has both endings. So you need to look at the book if you're buying it and check that it has both the original ending and the alternative ending to Great Expectations. And the Conan Doyle, I would suggest again getting the Penguin Classics, but there are multiple versions of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and you'll find them in many places, including online, if that suits you better. But again, I'd recommend the Penguin Classics as the handiest version. Okay, so I want to introduce then the Victorian period. It's a period, obviously, that's named after a queen rather than a time. It's not the 19th century, it's the Victorian period. And like all forms of periodization, that's a little bit false. The world didn't change when Queen Victoria came to the throne on 1837, and nor did it specifically change in 1901 when she died. Many of you will know that Queen Victoria was the longest reigning monarch in British history, and the period which she governed over, therefore, includes an immense amount of change. And in a way, you can see that change here in the different portraits of Queen Victoria herself that you see. So in 1830, this is very much a kind of Georgian England. The style of dress and even the style of painting gives you a sense of a kind of the last of the 18th century, a romantic period. By 1854, photography has been invented, and you see Queen Victoria here with her children, none of them looking particularly cheerful. But now photography has been invented. This is a sign of the changing times, a century of increasing technology, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then by 1897, photography has moved on even further, and this is the Queen Victoria towards the end of her life and her reign. So it's a period of immense change, and I want to just spend a couple of minutes taking you through some of the key moments in the century, and try to link that up with some of the cultural events that and the literary texts that we'll talk about. So the period before the ascent of Queen Victoria to the throne is dominated, I suppose, by several things. One of them is the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, partly by the Duke of Wellington, but also by the combined forces of various European countries. And that brings about the end of the French Revolution in some ways, the events sparked by the French Revolution, and also restores a kind of order and a monarchical order to Europe after a period of turmoil. The turmoil isn't over, though, in England and in Britain and in the United Kingdom as it was at the time, including the whole of the island of Ireland, because things start to pick up pace both in politics and in the world of technology and science, as we'll see in a minute. So, for example, the first railway is built from Stockton to Darlington in Yorkshire in 1825. And this is important for itself because it allows for, over the century, increasingly fast transport between different parts of the country, but also for the technological achievement that it represents, because psychologically it begins to give a sense of pace to history and to the contemporary society. The reason that I've put on here and picked out the Catholic Emancipation and the Reform Act of 1832 is also to give you then a sense that the Victorian period, or more broadly the 19th century, is a time when Britain is, as we would think of it, liberalising in various ways. Liberal philosophy, that is, increased freedom for various people, in these cases both the Catholic population of Britain and Ireland. Catholic emancipation gave more rights to those who were followers of the Roman Catholic Church, who had been discriminated in law and continued to be in some ways after this. But Catholic emancipation brought about more rights for Catholics within the United Kingdom. And equally significant is the Reform Act of 1832, which widens the franchise. That means that more people are allowed to vote. It's not universal franchise, that doesn't come around until much later. But it starts the process and is part of a wider process of liberalisation and a recognition that changes need to be made. This is partly also an indication of who is powerful in Britain during this period of the 19th century and then through the rest of the 19th century. Britain is moving, without the revolution that happened in France, is moving more slowly towards recognition that the bourgeoisie and the middle classes are the site of power in society and the site of wealth. So the widening of the franchise and to an extent Catholic emancipation is a recognition within the Parliament that power now lies with an increasingly large middle class. And the first poet that we'll study will be Alfred Tennyson. And his first poetry is written when he's a student at university and published just as he's leaving university in 1832, which is pre-Victorian, pre the ascent of Victoria to the throne. So it's important to realise that the Victorian period isn't a clean-cut periodisation of literary history or indeed history. And that Tennyson, as a poet who becomes probably the most famous poet of the Victorian period and representative of the Victorian period, is intellectually formed in the Romantic period, in the Georgian period. 1833 there and 1834 I've picked out the emancipation of slaves. Again, an important thing in and of itself, but also a realisation that Britain is moving towards a more liberal sense of the human. And in 1834, the Poor Law, which again recognises the need to cater for the poor in a different way has been done before. It's probably not something that we would think of as a liberal piece of legislation, but nevertheless there's a recognition there. And in 1838 is the beginnings of the Chartist movement, which is a working class movement, which we would now think of as a kind of trade unionist movement. So all of these things are happening, a kind of increasing of a liberal middle class and a liberal upper class, and the organisation of the working classes. Against that, one of the things we'll see in 1833 there is the Oxford movement, which becomes very influential throughout the 19th century. And that was a religious movement, which was trying to, in some ways, work against the increasing industrialization and mechanization of and capitalization of British society, and looked back. And the theological way that it looked back was that it wanted to bring the Anglican Church, that is the Protestant Church of England, back towards the Catholic Church. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So you can also see that during this period, just coming up to the ascent of Victoria, Dickens starts to publish his novels, and Pickwick Papers is his first it's a kind of episodic novel, and then Oliver Twist is his first novel as we would think of it. And then coming up to the end of the period, reform is still going on in the UK, in Ireland, the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, that is making sure that Catholics within Ireland don't have to pay tithes to the Protestant Church of Ireland, is a recognition of the need of reform in Ireland. But still imperial expansion is going on through the opening of the Suez Canal, for example, in 1869 under British control. Things are changing in Europe with the Franco-Prussian War that signals the beginning of the strength of a united Germany. And you can see that through this period still there is reform on the social side. So the Trade Unions Act, the Public Health Act are political reforms meant to recognise the need for representation of working class people and looking after of the public health of those who had previously been ignored. Alongside all of this, Britain is becoming more and more imperial, modelling itself on ancient empires. So in 1876, Victoria is proclaimed Empress of India. And yet still reform is going on in Ireland, partial through the Land Acts. On the cultural events there, Great Expectations, you can see in 1860 comes in this central period of the Victorian era. where reform is happening, where Dickens is a mature novelist, where he's published David Copperfield and Great Expectations, is a consideration of many of the types of themes and events and pressures that were going on in the Victorian period. And Goblin Market is another poem that we'll look at, set right in the middle of this period. And then just bringing the historical period to an end, we have the Liberal government in 1892, which leads to the Second Home Rule Bill, which is rejected, the Boer War in South Africa, and the death of Victoria, and then with the death of Tennyson. And just to place Conan Doyle, you can see that the early Sherlock Holmes stories come right at the end of the Victorian period. So at the kind of height of imperialism, which is very important for Conan Doyle, for the way he thinks of the world, the way he thinks of London, but also at this time of reform and change and uncertainty. So that gives us the kind of sense of the historical period, some of the events that happened during this period, and at least when it is. I want to focus on some of the themes that arise in the social sense through this period, and then think about how they might appear, how we might understand them, and then how some of them might appear in literary text. So I'm sure you know that the 19th century, a bit like the end of the 18th century, but particularly and at more pace in the 19th century, it's a period of industrialization. It's a period when cities get bigger, it's a period when the class structures change, and it's a period when the British Empire massively expanded. One of the things that we're lucky with in a way is that we do know a lot about the Victorian period because the Victorians were obsessed with their own time. They were obsessed with describing it and with recording it. They recorded it in words and they recorded it in numbers. The population of Britain expands in the period from about 25.5 million in 1837 to about 41 million in 1901. This obsession with statistics, for example, and the statistical societies which arose particularly in London and Manchester, is in fact parodied by Dickens in his novel Great Expectations, where he has Mr. Gradgrind, the industrialist, say, "Now what I want is facts, teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts are alone are wanted in life, plant nothing else and root out everything else." He's parodying this statistical and factual and reasoned, supposedly reasoned way of thinking. So let's think about some examples of how these things happen. We've seen that there's population expansion, and that happens particularly in the cities. We can see some of that exemplified in this graph here, which shows the annual growth of railway mileage in Britain between 1825 and 1911. And you can see that there's a constant growth through the period with some spikes, particularly in the middle of the century, an enormous amount of railway built there, and then in the 1860s as well. And this gives you then a sense that Britain is a more connected and a more industrialized country. The railways aren't just for the carriage of passengers, but for the carriage of freight as well. So Britain's railways and industrialization increased constantly over the period up until the 20th century. We can also see and evidence the way that class changes in Britain during the Victorian period because of this fascination that the Victorians had with their own statistics. So they were very keen on having censuses of the population, and they recorded lots of data, and we can use that data to see particular change. So I want to show you one particular way of thinking of that change. This shows you the distribution of socioeconomic status across, this excludes Ireland, so it's England, Wales and Scotland. On the left-hand side, you can see the combined totals. So the SE1 is a high-skilled non-manual labour, and that stays pretty much the same actually through the period. And that's here. And you see that through this period up to 1901, from 1851, it stays pretty much the same. What does change, though, is this category. This gets bigger over the period. And this category is the SE2. That's the lower skilled non-manual labourer. What we might think of as the middle class. That is somebody who is literate, numerate, and who is effectively a white-collar worker. They're not using their hands, they're using their brain. And the number and proportion of these workers increases steadily over the period. Here on this map, you can see the density of the population according to that SE2 category. And what you can see is that in the northern cities here, in Liverpool and in Manchester, that the percentage of those kind of white-collar workers in 1861 is high in those places. To 1901. So here's the same distribution map for 1901, and you can see now in the northern areas that those patterns, those kind of yellows, oranges and reds have increased. The cities have become denser, and there are more people who are of this SE2 social class working in those areas. And when we look at London, then it's almost entirely taken over these areas. So London by 1901 has completely transformed into a city which is probably dominated by those working in middle class professions, with immense poverty still in parts of the city, but nevertheless a kind of middle class and bourgeois dominated city. Okay, we also know, despite this, that the rise of the middle class and the bourgeoisie goes alongside immense working class poverty in the cities. And in those same cities we've just been looking at, particularly Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and London, and Newcastle to an extent as well. And the evidence from that comes from lots of sources, mainly people who visited these places and looked at the conditions of working class people. Here are two examples. On the left hand side is the German edition of Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England, actually not published in English for a couple of decades, but most intellectuals in Britain in the 1850s and afterwards would have known of Mayhew's book that's on the right hand side there, the London Labour and the London Poor, a 3-volume edition setting out in great detail, as it says, a cyclopedia of the condition and earnings of those that will work, those that cannot work, and those that will not work. So the final evidence that we might have for an expanded empire is probably this one of the most famous maps of the period, which versions of which appeared in British schoolrooms famously across the empire. And it was a map showing the territories owned or run by the British Empire, and with the British territories marked in pink. And this is from 1886. Actually, if you look at this map 20 years later, Africa would have had a lot more pink on it because of the what's called the Scramble for Africa later on. But you can see here that imperialism was very much part of British identity at the time. It tried to convey itself as a kind of family of nations with a centre in Britannia. So in the depiction here, you can see the figure of Britannia down in the middle, and the kind of adoration of the other parts of the empire, all looking towards the centre. And this is how the British saw themselves, the British Empire saw itself. Not everybody, but most people saw the British Empire at the time. One of the things as we go through the module is to think about the role of the British Empire and how it appears in the literature that we're looking at, because it's often thought that it's a silent factor in some of the novels and the poetry of the period. Okay, so the Victorian age then can be seen as a time of change and progress, and things increase in pace, they increase in density and in intensity and complexity. The Victorian period has a sense of its own grandeur as well, and its own capabilities. It's often inflected in a kind of sense of imperial ambition, but also in its ability to materially manifest its own grandeur and its own superiority. And this appears in lots of different ways. This, what you see on the screen here, is one example of this, the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, which goes over the Avon River, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel and opened in 1863, and much feted at the time as a great feat of Victorian engineering, partly because of the way that it was built, but also the materials that were used to build it. And so there's a kind of grandeur about the Victorian period, at least in its public presentation of itself. Another way of thinking of this is through the event and the building of the Crystal Palace. This is the Crystal Palace, built in 1851 to house the Great Exhibition, as it was called. The Crystal Palace is important in and of itself because it is a great feat of engineering. It was built of glass and steel, and the ability to make the curved glass that you see at the top there on the roof was a relatively new one. So this is the height of modern technology in order to build this. Inside the Crystal Palace in the Great Exhibition, there was an enormous exhibition of both the culture of the empire and indeed of the rest of the world, and of the industrial achievements of Britain and its empire. It was one of the biggest public events of the Victorian period, and this gives you some sense of the scale of it. Here, people paid for days and months to come and visit it. It was socially stratified, and you could come on certain days, pay a certain amount, so that rich people came and paid more and were guaranteed that their own class were there at the time. But it is a really extraordinary public event. The Victorians were also keen on creating for themselves a kind of civic space and an organised civic culture. The Royal Albert Hall here in Kensington in London is a kind of sign of this sense of needing to build long-standing and imperial public spaces. The Royal Albert Hall has echoes of Italian and Roman and Greek buildings, amphitheatres, but yet in a Victorian style, so both classical and contemporary at the same time. So there's a rise in a sense of a kind of organised civic culture, and that is both bombastic and outward looking, but it's also underneath that occasionally about political reform. One of the ways in which civic culture was reformed during the period was through the rather banal but important issue of sanitisation and providing proper sanitation for all classes in society. Charles Dickens was particularly interested in the sanitation of working class areas, and Joseph Chamberlain, who became later Prime Minister of Britain, was the leader of the change of sanitation and provision of public health in Birmingham, for example. Is how he made his political career. So all of this seems to suggest that we have a period of achievement and progress. There's a kind of liberalisation of society, there's a growth of the empire, there's immense industrialisation, there's technological change, and this seems to suggest that a lot of the literature of the period would be very much in this mode, but it's not really. The Victorian period is full of literature which is directly about the period, but as we'll see, it's not generally as convinced by its own period as the period itself seems to suggest. Like any period, the Victorian one was one full of anxiety. There's a particularly in the literature an anxiety about the nature of the progress that is being made. So let me run through some of these effects that I think we'll see in literary texts, and then I'll come on to talk about more specifically about the kinds of anxieties that the Victorians had. So we've already talked about industrialisation, urbanisation, class change, and the expanded empire. How might these things affect the way we see literary texts? Well, the expanded population, for example, and class change mean that there are increased rates of literacy. You see down at the bottom of the screen, in 1800, about 40% of males and 60% of females in Britain were illiterate. By 1900, only 3% of the entire adult population is illiterate. So very clearly that means that more people can read by the end of the century, and that there are increasing numbers of people who can read as the century goes on. What that means is that there are middle-class people and lower middle-class people and working people who now can read as the century goes through. And that there are increasing numbers of people as the new bourgeoisie and the new middle class and a new kind of upper working class, you might say, expands, people who have some disposable income. The novel then becomes the popular form of the Victorian period because more people can read, because it's cheaper to publish novels, and because it's a profitable thing to do to publish novels because there's a bigger audience. The novel then reflects the society that people live in. So the novels are increasingly set in urban settings because that's where the audience for novels are living. Novels and poetry reflect the fact that class change is happening. So the narrative forms of novels in the period are often about class difference, and class change. Novels that are about the period often work in the same way that Mayhew's book, The London Labour and the London Poor, worked, as a kind of social testimony. That is, that novels and poetry reflect on the world that they live in. And one of the modes of the Victorian period was a kind of journalistic mode, which thought about the period and actually gave evidence to the period about itself in the way that the Victorian obsession with statistics did. One of the features of fiction that is often thought of as important then in the 19th century is a new form of realism in fiction. That's partly derived from the movement towards realism in French novel writing, which is happening at the same time and a little bit before. But it's also derived from this will to give testimony through fiction. That is, to show what actual conditions are like in Victorian England. Now, realism is a difficult term. It assumes that what you're reading in a novel is an actual description of how the world actually is. And that's not often what happens in novels. Novels are forms that tell stories that are usually quite neat. So we'll see in Dickens and talk about whether Dickens is a realist novelist or not. And the answer is that in some ways he is, and in some ways he isn't. But realism in fiction is one thing to consider as we go through. We've talked about empire and the expansion of empire during the Victorian period, and I've already suggested that we need to think a little bit about the empire as a feature of the literature that we'll read. When you come to read, for example, Great Expectations, you'll see that the entire novel is set in and around London and the marshes of the Thames. But Australia features very large in the novel, and the fact of Britain's particular imperial relationship with Australia actually means that the plot of the novel functions. So the empire is there in Great Expectations, it's there in the other writings as well, not always as an absolutely explicit and central theme, not as a setting necessarily, but certainly as an other, as one might say. And one last thing maybe to think about the effects seen in literary texts, and thinking particularly ahead to Conan Doyle, but also actually thinking about Dickens as well, is that crime becomes a major theme in Victorian literature, both law and crime, the breaking of laws and the keeping of laws, and law as a structure for society, because laws become increasingly complex during the 19th century as industrialization takes place and as capitalism increases. Okay, I want to move on then and think about one particular form of anxiety that the Victorians experienced. And we might characterize this as, and it often is characterized as, a debate between religious faith and scientific knowledge. And an interesting place to start for us with this is to look at a building which is on our campus. This is the College Chapel of as it was then St Patrick's College, Maynooth. It's now the Pontifical University. It was built between 1875 and 1891 and designed by J.J. McCarthy, an Irish architect. McCarthy was inspired by the architect of some of the original buildings in St Patrick's from the earlier in the 19th century, which were designed by the British architect Augustus Pugin. Pugin was influenced himself by what I described earlier, the Oxford movement. This is a movement back towards a kind of Anglo-Catholicism and away from the Protestantism of the Church of England. Pugin's interest was in medieval architecture, in reviving pre-Reformation architecture, and in returning to the kind of ornate Gothic structures of medieval architecture as a way of countering the ill effects, as he saw it, of industrialization. Pugin shows this in his 1836 book, written when he was a very young man, called Contrasts, and here is a famous illustration from that book. And the contrast is between what he sees as a way that a town should look, which is the illustration on the top, that is of the many churches, all in the medieval and Gothic style, and the pseudo-medieval bridge and the city walls. It's a kind of feudal version of how Britain should be. And underneath that, and against that, how Britain is becoming to look in his view. Square, industrial, the spires replaced by the chimneys of factories. And for him, the top is how things should be, the bottom is how things are becoming. So Pugin is important because of his Anglo-Catholic background, but also because he represents and symbolises a division within the Victorian period between those who are proponents of progress, as it's called, and those who wish it to halt. And this is also a theological division as well. So this brings us perhaps to the most famous moment, not the only moment, of fracture in the Victorian period, which is the publication of Darwin's famous book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. And this is the title page, and as you can see, it's the origin of species by means of natural selection, of the preservation of favoured races in a struggle for life. And it's really important to think about the whole title here. Darwin's book argues that the species that currently exist on Earth are there because of a natural process, that is a process embodied in nature, and they are there and selected by nature, and that they get there by struggle. They struggle for life. And this is important because, and as Darwin knew himself, this presented a new version of a kind of metaphysics of humanity. And Darwin's theories were around in Darwin's mind and in other people's minds for several decades, maybe even before And he was very wary of publishing The Origin of Species because he knew that the impact of the book would be such that it would disrupt Victorian religious ways of thinking, and actually centuries-long religious ways of thinking. So Darwin, in the introduction to The Origin of Species, says about his famous journey on the Beagle, which began his global view of what became the theory of evolution. He travelled on the HMS Beagle as a naturalist, as he said, and he said, "I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the inhabitants of South America and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent." One of the things this emphasises for us is the journey that Darwin took. The theory of evolution comes about partly because Darwin is able to travel on a naval ship, a protected naval ship, using the Navy as a military force, the British Navy, and was able to travel around South America. And that's the voyage of the Beagle. On the map of the world, you can see that he went the whole way around the world, stopped off at different places, particularly in South America, but he was able to do this because of Britain's imperial power. So the theory of evolution is linked to the fact that Darwin could safely sail the seas as part of the most powerful navy in the world, knowing that they weren't going to be attacked, or if they did, they could defend themselves, and that they had the run of the seas in order to undertake their voyage. So Darwin's theory of evolution then comes about in various ways. Darwin, on the Beagle voyage, collected barnacles from ships and also from rocks that he found on the shores, and he became particularly obsessed with barnacles as a younger man, a younger naturalist in Britain. And when he was studying at Cambridge, he was obsessed with snails, and he catalogued snails. And as he travelled around the world, he found, and this is a very banal way from one of the most important scientific discoveries ever to come about, he discovered many different species of barnacles. And it was the variety of species that he found that fascinated him, just as the snails had fascinated him in his work in England. He was only able to undertake this work because he was from a relatively wealthy family and he could take time off. He was actually training to be an Anglican priest. And he took time off from his training and went on this voyage. And his theory of evolution began with these apparently insignificant creatures, not with apes and monkeys and man. Darwin found that the barnacles that he looked at came in many shapes and sizes, that the fossil record shows that there were shapes and types of barnacles which persisted through time. So some of the barnacles he found he could find in fossils. Some of the barnacles that he found were not apparent in the fossils. It was clear to Darwin that there were some species of some species of barnacles which used to exist and which no longer did, and some which currently existed, which had always existed or existed in different forms. And what he found was a variety amongst them. And his key finding, I suppose, was that the barnacles were adapted to their circumstances. He had particular interests in the sexual reproduction of barnacles, for example, and how they managed to do that, and found that that in itself was related to the conditions in which they lived. When he went to the Galapagos, famously studied the flightless birds, the tortoises, found that the flightless birds were flightless in his mind because they didn't need to fly, therefore had lost the ability to fly, because flying was of no use to them. They had evolved, in other words, not to be able to fly. One of the things he studied were finches on the different islands, and he found that finches that were closely related had different kinds of beaks. And when he looked at the conditions in which they lived on their particular island, he found that those finches that lived on those particular islands were those that were best adapted to survive on the particular island. So it's often thought then that this finding by Darwin, this idea of natural selection, in other words, if you're a finch with a small thin beak on an island on which a finch with a large thick beak has a better chance of surviving, the thin-beaked finch will die out, the large-beaked finch will flourish, and in fact its beak will probably get bigger so that it can survive better. This is the finding that he comes to. This, of course, completely changes the religious notion of what life on Earth is. A literal biblical sense of what life on Earth is tells us that all species were made by God at the same time, simultaneously, at the moment of creation, in the first week of creation. And they were all wiped out, but all saved in the flood and repopulated the world. And therefore, the idea that species might change, that it might be some force in nature which selects which species change, and that this might happen without a creator animating it, is a shocking idea to the Victorians. It's one of the reasons that Darwin didn't publish his findings for a long time, because they seem to contradict the very literalist version of a deist creation. Now, Darwin wasn't the first person to come up with some of these theories, and going back into the 18th century, the French scientist called Lamarck, for example, had noticed the inheritance of characteristics amongst various animals. For example, he had speculated that giraffes' necks got longer over time so that they could feed better, but he didn't have a mechanism for understanding it. What actually happened in 1857 was that another naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was self-taught, who had left school at 14, had been travelling the world on a kind of poverty basis, but nevertheless travelling the world, collecting specimens, sending them back to scientists in Britain, including Darwin. And Wallace had essentially come to the same conclusion as Darwin. That is, he had realised and was able to outline what was in fact a theory of evolution. And Wallace sent a paper to the Royal Society in 1857 outlining his theory of evolution. Now, Wallace's standing socially and scientifically was not as great as Darwin's, and Darwin's supporters, who knew privately what his ideas were, what his research were horrified that the theory of evolution might actually be attributed to Wallace rather than Darwin. So Darwin was persuaded to read his paper alongside Wallace's at the Royal Society in 1858, and Origins of Species then was published in 1859, and it was a rushed publication. But Darwin's theories had been around for a long time, and the reason that's important is that it isn't 1859 as a moment in the Victorian period which creates this sudden change in the way that people think about the world around them. This had been building over decades. Darwin's grandfather, for example, Erasmus Darwin, had actually proposed similar ideas to Darwin, often in his poetry. Back in 1837, Darwin himself had speculated on what was essentially the theory of evolution. This is a notebook of Darwin's from 1837. And in 1837, he says, "I think," and then draws the diagram. And the diagram is a kind of tree of life, which is in and of itself a theory of natural selection and the evolution of species. Darwin, in that notebook, says the grand question which every naturalist ought to have before him when dissecting a whale or classifying a mite, a fungus, or an infusorian is, what are the laws of life? And Darwin's consideration of that 20 years later leads him to publish his theory of evolution and the origin of species. But these things had been around for much longer. Chambers' book, Vestiges, published originally in 1844, this is a later edition, was originally published anonymously. Chambers also published a tree diagram to show the evolution, or at least the descent of species. And in that book, that anonymously published book in 1844, wondered at a creator, in other words, a God, who could have interfered with his own creation. And this was because Chambers was using primarily the fossil record at that point. Fossil discovery had been around for some time. And thinking about the fact that the fossil record showed extinction, that is, that some species came to an end and no longer existed, and that some species changed. And that extinction and change of species was counter to the version of creation that was traditional within the Genesis narrative and the Genesis narrative as understood within Christianity. But it wasn't only naturalists who were creating this sense of uncertainty about how the world came to be. The fossil record had shown that species used to exist and now no longer existed, that species changed over time. But even before that, from the 1830s, in particular, 1820s too, but particularly in the 1830s with the publication of Lyell's Principles of Geology, there had been a realization about the nature of time. Lyell's Principles of Geology, and here's an illustration from it of Mount Etna, proposed that the age of the Earth from the fossil record had to be much longer than the Bible suggested. There's a famous account in Archbishop Usher, an Irish bishop actually, from centuries earlier, who had used the Bible to work out how old the earth was, and Usher was actually able to date the moment of creation both to a day and a time, approximately 6,000 years previously to the moment that he was writing. So the earth for him was around 6,000 years old. He used the Old Testament to work out how old the earth was. Lyell's geology showed that the earth was hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old. And this then ran counter to the literal Christian version of what the earth was. It also showed the forces of nature to be something that were internal to nature. And this is why Mount Etna is important and why volcanoes are important, because volcanoes create mountains. And Lyell's recognition that Mount Etna is created by a volcano and not by God's hand was in itself at the time something a little shocking. So the story of evolution changes the story for the Victorians of what nature is. Nature becomes not God's work, but something outside of humanity, something with a long time span, and something that at best does not care about humanity. The Christian story of creation clearly has a God who controls creation, but also cares in different ways, some of them less, some of them more brutal than others, but nevertheless cares for and intervenes in human history. The version of nature that the geologists, the fossilists, those collecting the fossils, and the naturalists are constructing in the 19th century is one in which nature works over a long time span, in which nature does not care particularly for humans more than any other species, in which species can be wiped out and not reappear, and in which the world is, as Darwin has it, a struggle for existence. So this struggle, this new way of understanding the world, appears constantly in Victorian culture. We talked about the Crystal Palace before in the Great Exhibition, and at the Crystal Palace outside, as you can see here from this engraving, in the gardens of the Crystal Palace were these concrete structures, statues made of concrete as we would understand it, by George Baxter, and they were of dinosaurs. So he created this dinosaur park, which you could go and visit as part of the Great Exhibition. And those are still there today. There they are, people visiting them today at the old site of the Crystal Palace. So the Victorians were fascinated with this new world that they had discovered. They tortured themselves with it. They tried to understand it. They tried to take control of it. But it was constantly there in their world. So I want to finish up with this painting to give you a sense of how these debates around a traditional form of religious faith and a hostile world that has no God in it start to feature in Victorian culture, because we will see this constantly in the literary texts that we are going to read. This is a painting by William Dyce, and it's different titles, but it's usually known as Pegwell Bay, Kent, a recollection of October the 5th, 1858. And it's a painting of, as you can see, of a seashore with a kind of family group in the foreground and people in the background. There are cliffs and then the sea. There are all kinds of ways in which this is a symbolic painting. Dyce himself was associated with the Pre-Raphaelite movement, and we'll have a look at them later in the module because they're important for understanding Christina Rossetti. The Pre-Raphaelite movement were painters who wanted to go back, a bit like Pugin, to a kind of medieval style of art, but they were constantly drawn into their own period as well, the Victorian period. They were associated with a kind of realism or hyper-realism in their painting. So you can see that in some ways this is a realist painting, but you can also see that there's a kind of formalism here too. Other things that we see in the painting are a kind of family group, people who are separated. They're not talking to each other. They're slightly looking into the distance, the character in the foreground on the right and the child on the left. The two women in the centre are looking at the ground and gathering things from the ground, and they're looking at stones, picking up stones. This area is made of chalk. There are chalk cliffs. It's the best kind of area to go in England to find fossils. It also happens to be the place where St. Augustine, in the early Christian period, arrived in Britain. He arrived at this point to spread Christianity in Britain. So if we think of it in that way, then what we have is a place where you find fossils, a place where Christianity begins in Britain, simultaneously seen as the same place. We have people looking for fossils. We have people who look a bit distracted, who look straight out of the painting in the case of the woman in the bottom right, straight out at the viewer in a quizzical kind of way. And we can see in the background, excuse me, a more industrial kind of looking for fossils going on as well. So this painting gives us a sense of these twin forces at work. Christianity, a kind of look back to the medieval period, and the contemporary scientific interest in collecting fossils at the same time. And if we think this is overreading it, then we need to think about the date. The painting is always given the date of a recollection of October the 5th, 1858. And on that day in the 19th century, October the 5th, 1858, visible in the sky was a comet known as Donati's comet. And you can't see it in this version because it's not detailed enough, but if I show you a detail from the sky, you can see just here in the sky in this painting is Donati's comet. So Dyce's interest here is to put together a painting which shows us these twin forces together, the interest in preserving a kind of society which is held together by traditional religious beliefs, by a world that is safely within a theology that gives you a beginning and an end, and in which there is a creator who is interested in you, and in which there's a possibility of eternal life and salvation and a soul that will carry on forever. And on the other hand, the fossil record. And the fossil record shows, as we now know, that life is a struggle, that you might die and die out, and your species might die out, and that nature is a force beyond your control. So the Victorian period then is one in which we see all of these forces together, in which the literature of the period reflects both an interest in understanding the new world that they're inhabiting, this changed, industrialized, imperial, class-ridden world in which everything is changing, and which is also immensely anxious about this, both in a kind of metaphysical way and in a social way. So these are the kinds of things we'll see in the literary texts that we're going to examine over the rest of the module.